Hello, today I'm going to talk to you about how blood and blood pressure work throughout our body. So first I'm going to talk about the short-term neural control of blood pressure. And the first thing to talk about when you're explaining this is cardiac output. So cardiac output is the quantity of blood or the volume of blood that is pumped by the heart per minute. Increasing heart rate or increasing the stroke volume increases cardiac output. Cardiac output is measured in milliliters per minute and is calculated by heart rate, beats per minute, times volume, milliliters per beat. An average person's heart rate is 70 beats per minute and a resting stroke volume of 70 milliliters per beat. Next, I need to explain what peripheral resistance is. This is the force required to maintain blood flow from the base of the aorta to the venous exit into the auriculars. Calculating resistance in the flow is equal to driving measure divided by resistance. Finally, I'm going to explain now what the control of blood pressure is. So a neural regulation of blood pressure is controlled through cardiovascular centers and baroreceptor stimulation. In cardiovascular centers, a cluster of neurons that play a role in regulating blood pressure and its flow. It regulates the activity of the heart, intestines, and glands, and these also include respiration, metabolism, blood pressure, and digestion. Baroreceptors are receptors located in the areas of blood vessels and chambers of hearts that respond to the degree of stretch caused by the presence of blood. Low pressure baroreceptors located in the right atrium. When blood pressure increases, these receptors are stretched more tightly and initiate an action potential at a higher action, while at low blood pressure, the degree of stress is lower and the rate of firing is slower. The next thing I'm going to talk about is how blood flows through the heart. So the first thing you need to understand is that a heartbeat happens because of systole and diastole. Whenever you listen to the heart, you hear a lub-dub sound. This is the systole and diastole of your heart. So the lub sound is systole and the dub sound is diastole. The compression of the heart is the systole and the expansion of the heart is the diastole. When the atrium of the heart diastoles, then blood enters into the heart from various parts of the body. Contaminated blood, or blood with excess CO2, enters into the right atrium through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Pure blood, or blood with excess oxygen, enter into the left atrium from the lungs through the pulmonary vein. Contaminated blood enters into the right atrium from the heart through the coronary sinus. The bicuspid and tricuspid valves stay closed at this time. When the atrium fills with blood, they compress. This is also known as systole of atriums. When the blood pressure increases in the atrium, then the bicuspid and tricuspid valves open. Then the contaminated blood comes into the right ventricle from the right atrium, and the pure blood goes into the left ventricle from the left atrium. The ventricles expand, also known as diastole, at this time. When the ventricles fill with blood, they compress. This is known as systole of the ventricles. When the blood pressure increases in the ventricles, the bicuspid and tricuspid valve remain closed and the pulmonary and aortic valves open. When the contaminated blood comes into the pulmonary artery, it comes in through the right ventricle and pure blood comes into the aorta from the left ventricle. Now I'm going to explain how blood circulates through the body. So in order to explain how blood is circulated through the body, I will explain what systemic circulation, pulmonary circulation, hepatic portal circulation, and coronary circulation is. So systemic circulation is the circulation of oxygenated blood when it enters into the blood cells from the heart through arteries. Then the contaminated blood, or blood with carbon dioxide, goes back to the heart from the blood cells through the veins. Pulmonary circulation is when circulated blood comes into the lungs from the heart through the pulmonary artery and goes back into the heart through the pulmonary vein. Hepatic portal circulation is circulated blood that spreads into the parts of the stomach, pancreas, liver, and intestines through the artery and goes back into the liver cell through the portal vein. Then blood goes back into the heart through the hepatic vein. Coronary circulation occurs in the heart muscle. Oxygenated blood comes into cardiac muscle from the left ventricle through coronary artery and goes back to the heart through the coronary sinus. So when you combine all these steps, you see how blood is able to go from one step to the next and able to bring all the oxygen that your body needs and remove the carbon dioxide that it doesn't. By taking all these steps, everything is reached and the blood is able to return to the heart and then be sent back out as needed. Now I'm going to explain the pressures involved in tissue perfusion. First, I'll explain what tissue perfusion is, and then I'm going to explain the pressures involved in tissue perfusion. Tissue perfusion is the process of supplying cells and nutrients to living cells and the removal of waste products from the living cells. Now to explain the pressures involved in tissue perfusion. There are mainly two types of pressures involved in this, the first being hydrostatic pressure and the other being osmotic pressure. So what is hydrostatic pressure? What does that mean and what does it do? So hydrostatic pressure is pressure exerted by a fluid in a confined space. It is the primary force that transports fluid between capillaries and tissues. When force exerted by blood within the blood vessel is called blood hydrostatic pressure. When force is exerted by blood against the wall of the capillary, it is called capillary hydrostatic pressure. This force helps the fluid to move out of the capillaries and into the tissue. Fluid leaves the capillaries and gets into tissues. This will cause a rise in hydrostatic pressure of interstitial fluid. The opposite of hydrostatic pressure is called interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure. So now that we understand what hydrostatic pressure is, let's move on to osmotic pressure. So osmotic pressure is the pressure exerted by the fluid to prevent the backflow of solvent into the solution through a semipermeable membrane. So reabsorption of fluid into interstitial fluid to back into the capillaries is called osmotic pressure. Plasma proteins do not dissolve and are suspended in the fluid. This forms a colloid. Pressure exerted by the colloidal proteins are called blood colloidal osmotic pressure. This colloidal pressure helps in the reabsorption of water. Plasma proteins never move across the semipermeable membrane, so the colloidal concentration increases and the water concentration becomes decreased. So this results in the backflow of water with dissolved molecules into the capillary. After leaving the capillaries, the fluid moves into the tissue, so the hydrostatic pressure will then increase. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. What the heck was that? The quality of quantity, not quality. The peripheral. They compensate or compensate. They compress systole of the atrium. And ow! Dang it. And tissue perfusion. Hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic.